Well, I hope you all hang out till 8 and drink some bubbly with us. I'm going to start with some thanks. A big thank you to Brian, of course, for the invitation to show here, and to Wes for all the help installing and getting the work in here and making it happen. And a extra big thank you to all of you for being here. One of the things that I always like to start with at any kind of artist talk is to think back to Jerry Sauls and the way he talks about the art world as an all-volunteer army. And this evening I get to be the one that sits up here, but the only reason I get to sit up here and Brian gets to sit up here is because you all are willing to also do another job in the army of sitting out there and hitting the galleries up tonight. So thank you. Thanks for being here. The longer I've done this art thing, the teaching thing and the sculpture thing, the more I've come around to thinking that it's not as much my place or ability to be able to say what the work is about. It actually feels harder and harder to be able to do that. What I feel more confident in being able to do is to share where I think the work came from or what led to the work, and so most of this afternoon is going to kind of come from there. So trying to talk about what are some of the inputs, and then we'll see what the outputs might be. So I guess starting from that point, it's really impossible for me to talk about this work without talking about the last couple of years of my life and what's been going on in there. And so when Brian was kind enough to make the invitation to me to show here, was super exciting, and also this gift of time in terms of, like, Brian gives a long runway towards the show, which is really special. It's different from a lot of cases, and so you have time to really think about the space and how you want to respond to the space, how you want to occupy the space, how the work might live in the space, but also you have time to really think about or allow a body of work to generate. In this case, Brian extended the invitation, and then right around that same window of time, there was this rapid fire series of events in my life where my grandmother passed away, and then my mom passed away, and then my mom's house burned down. My childhood home, which is a heavy place to start. We're going to move from that, and it's one of those cases where I don't necessarily think that is the content of the work. I don't want that to be the content of the work, but it's unavoidable. It's impossible for me to talk about most of this work or where it came from without kind of acknowledging the headspace that goes with that. I recently heard Scott Galloway speaking after the loss of his father, and he was talking about how that our brains are exactly the wrong size, that's our competitive advantage as a species, is our brain and our compute power, but that our brains are big enough to, like, think of and conceive of these really complicated questions, but they're not big enough to answer the questions. And that death is one of those topics that our brains haven't caught up with yet. We don't have the compute power to really kind of reconcile what that is, or what the implications of it are, or what it means, et cetera. And that the loss of a parent especially is devastating for most of us, in that way of we are that our brains work in terms of continuity and pattern. Like, that's what we're hardwired for. And so when you have this person that has always been there and then they're not, it's like a really challenging thing to process mentally, right? Because it breaks the continuity that is what is your assumption of reality. So to sort of pivot from that heavy business towards what has been topics kind of long-standing in the work. Those of you who are familiar with what's been going on for the last 15 or 20 years, most of it's been work that has motion involved in some way or another, kinetics, mechanisms, moving images, and that line of inquiry has been rooted in this question about motion and the ability for motion to communicate, especially a psychological state. Most of that work is non-narrative, purposefully to lever this question about time in a kind of inverted way, which is that it's mimicking your temporal logic, that it's pointing to this moment on the timeline, asserting itself over and over again as a way of trying to think about or talk about the most unattainable or inaccessible things, which is anything in the past, the stuff that there's no way to get back to. And so the kind of inversion of pointing at and asserting this particular current moment as a way of thinking about the past or time in general, if that makes sense. So kind of moving from that to maybe talk about a few of the pieces in the space right now, and then I think it would be productive maybe to just go to questions after going through some of the pieces. But the two large pieces with the glass kind of ended up being anchor pieces for the show early on. Conceptually, they came out of going back to my mom's house, and as executor, sort of like looking at and dealing with and assessing what was there. And when I was a little kid, I was in Indiana before we moved to Tennessee. We lived way out in the country, like down a dirt road, driveway over the railroad tracks. And at the time, there were all the old glass insulators, the telephone poles along the railroad tracks. And there were a bunch of them just down along the tracks. And so it's like proper farm kid business, farm family action, but we got a couple of the cross pieces with the insulators on them, and they went on poles in the backyard, and that was what our clothesline was hung on. And so then when we moved from Indiana to Tennessee, those cross pieces came with us, the clothesline came with us. So going back, and after the fire, there was nothing left of the house but the things around the house, including all these insulators were still there. And so there was this moment of like looking at those glass objects, individual glass objects, and thinking about what is a carrier for memory, or thinking kind of along the lines of Tom Friedman, this conversation about quanta or quantum, like tiny packets of information, or the kind of tiniest fragments of things, and how those tiny fragments kind of work in multiple or multiplication. So like that idea from him, but also there's a particular starburst piece that he made with toothpicks. So kind of like pulling from those ideas and that aesthetic, and then also looking at like late Frank Stella work and this idea of stellation, which is taking an ideal form like an Archimedean solid or a Platonic solid, and that as you think of the facets as planes, as you move those planes out, then you create new three-dimensional forms by the new intersections of those planes. And so you end up with these kind of like starburst or star-shaped objects. So it's kind of like blooming and multiple and pattern in those objects. In that way also of, when I was a kid, I remember this moment of we were gonna buy a new car, and the conversation was like, first, what color of a car? And so we were gonna get a blue car, and then all of a sudden you start noticing all the blue cars that are on the road, and I didn't like. All of a sudden, then it was like paying attention to all the power lines on the road again, and those cross pieces, and so this like drive back and forth, like all these trips to do the business of executor, and like thinking about just like the passage of those telephone poles. So the video piece that's behind me is actually video footage of a kind of sculptural contraption in the studio that requires like really controlled light, but it's a mechanism that just rotates with these little 3D printed power poles and that light cast on it, so you get this kind of endless loop of that passage. So thinking also about like transit and like physicality of movement and movement through time, transit of time. Where to from there? I guess in that moment where some of the other things came from is all of that driving is, after a while, the playlist gets old. And so shifted over to podcasts, and was a total latecomer to the podcast scene. But in that same kind of selective perception moment, like all of a sudden you're listening to things and it's like, oh my, like, why is, like, it just happens that this interview that's on right now is about these things that are on my mind right now. So there was this interview with Stephen Colbert where he was talking about having lost some of his family members when he was really young. And he was speaking from a more kind of spiritual place, but there was this moment where he said, if you're going to be thankful for this life, you have to be thankful for everything, even the thing you wish had most never happened. Which I haven't quite gotten there with that yet, but this kind of similar line of thinking in, say, Buddhism or Stoicism, which is when a thing is taken away from you, it's done to make room for higher learning, or to allow for new perspective. And so the piece on the wall with the moon behind Jason. Jason, would you perfect, thank you. Kind of came out of one of those. There was that interview, and then I heard another interview with Pico Iyer, and he was quoting this poem, which is 17th century haiku, which is at the bottom, but this idea of this person whose house burned down, and then once the house was burned down, he thought, well, and now I have this better view of the rising moon. So this the kind of thought of, like, when one thing is gone, what does it reveal? What are the new opportunities that might exist in that life and growing are a subtractive process, maybe. So that's that one, and then there's a piece on the wall over here that's kind of hidden around the corner from you all at the moment. So when you're drinking your bubbly later, you can enjoy it. But it's a bronze casting on a wooden plinth, and it's a flame, but it's the mandorla of a particular kind of Buddhist icon, which is this figure that looks like a demon, especially to us from the West who are unfamiliar. It's got like these crazy snaggle teeth and blue skin often. It looks like totally fearsome and terrifying, but it's actually a protector spirit. And the idea is, like, the flame is the kind of like righteous anger that goes with protecting something that you love or care about. So that's from a digital file from a museum that has a scan of one of these statues, and in a kind of Paul Pfeiffer moment, it's like the figure is removed and the plinth is removed, and all that's left behind is that flame, that sort of like the righteous anger, which is then counterpart to the piece in the stairwell, which is pulled from the same imagery, kind of in repetition up the stairs. There's several pieces in here that are kind of pulled from video games, so maybe I'll pivot to that for a minute. The piece in the windowsill near Brian is one of those. I've spoken with some of you about the work before, but sometimes there's like an idea that just won't leave you alone, and you're unsure, like, what's the value of this thing, or why would I commit the time to that? And eventually, it leaves you alone, or you have to do it. And that was one of those kind of projects. And the thing that always stood out to me, it's from this video game called Mega Man, and if any of you have played it at any point, one of the weird things about it, this is like 80s Nintendo action, but the way you got an extra life in the video game was you would find the main character's severed head, like a giant version of his severed head somewhere in the game, but somewhere where it was really hard to get to, which, is like a middle schooler is like so weird, but you just roll with it, and then 20 years later you're still like, that's kind of weird. And so then there was this moment where my wife and I were in Turkey, and Mount Nimra in eastern Turkey, there were these colossal stone heads just in the desert on this hill, and it was this kind of archaeological mystery for a long time. And then they finally discovered that they were markers that there was a tomb of a first century BC king kind of in the ground, in the desert, beneath these abandoned stone heads. And that was one of those like, okay, maybe there's something here to be explored or ventured further, that the giant severed head is this sort of mechanism for resurrection, that this king who was like completely forgotten to history was then rediscovered, and there's a new narrative and endeavoring to understand who and why this person existed and so on. So there are actually several pieces in here that have kind of been mined from that game in different ways. The piece on the wall here is a similar moment of one of the hallmarks of that game was the music. There's like this really driving, and part of the aesthetic of the design was rock and roll. That the music was kind of oriented around these rock beats and like this high energy, kind of choose your own adventure play. But then when the power meter runs down, the main character is this robot that's defeating other robots to save the planet. But when the power meter runs all the way down, he doesn't just like fall over, he explodes. It's like this atomic explosion. But the music completely stops. Like all of a sudden it goes to silence, and all you have is like this sort of like reverb of these pieces slowly flying across the screen, which is like totally like shocking the first time you're playing the game and that happens. So there's like that kind of moment embedded in that. And then there's several paintings. Can I call them paintings? There's several things that are paint on a surface that are all images that are pulled in different ways from the game. So some of them are very legible, kind of background imagery inspired by scenery from that game, and others are like really burrowing in to like individual pixel level kind of detail and background to find compositions. Those ones are out of this totally different kind of line of thought, but overlapping, which was reading an article several years ago about how everything is digital. And that I have more pictures on my phone of my cat than were made of like most monarchy pre-1800. But that if the web like melts down, it's all gone. There's no physical remnant of that to be discovered by some future archaeologist. And so this idea of kind of digital spaces and digital landscapes and possibilities of archiving versus being fortunate enough to spend the past 2 summers in Italy and looking at like remnant Roman fresco and Roman mosaic, and so thinking about the sort of like tiling pattern of 8-bit imagery and mosaic imagery, but also the not permanence of one, but the kind of archival possibilities of one versus the archival nightmare of anything digital. So these are paint on travertine, which are pieces that were left over from some construction work. It's like homework we were having done at our house. So kind of remnant action, thinking about what's accessible, what's not accessible, what's archival, but also thinking about this building and the history of this building and stone. Was that 10 minutes or 2 hours, Brian? Where are we at?
You're doing great.
Yeah?
Keep going.
There's a couple more pieces. I guess I'll cruise through the last few and then we can do some questions. There's 2 drawings of daffodils over here. Those are daffodils that I helped my mom plant when I was little, and that was another, like, one of the trips back. There's like burnt foundation, but then these daffodils popping up, and so dug up several buckets of the daffodils. So some of those are growing in our front yard now. Again, not continuity, but kind of like layers of translation, that they're kind of the same daffodils, but they're not the same daffodils. But then 3D scanning the daffodils and having a digital file of the daffodils, and then working from the digital file to make a drawing. And so this kind of like iteration, and like where, if anywhere, was it the same thing, or is it getting closer to the essence of that thing, or further from the essence of that thing through those processes, but also in those moments of translation that the geometry of the flower gets, I don't know if clarified is the right word, but it gets strengthened. And so thinking about that geometry and then back to these starburst pieces, and that's one of those curatorial moves where when Brian and I were talking about placement, that was like revealed to me. Like instantly Brian was like, these can go right here with this piece. And I was like, wow, those look great. And then there's one more video piece here around the corner from you too, which is total minimalist gesture, but this past year when we were overseas, we got to spend a couple of days in Vienna, and the Natural History Museum in Vienna is where the Venus of Willendorf is, which is kind of like, I don't know even know what the corollary is, but it's like if you're within 100 miles of that, you should go see it, right? And has anybody else been? Has anybody seen it before? It's pretty cool. It's like it has its own little room, and there's this display, and it's sort of like the crown jewels. Like it's got its own little vitrine that I'm sure is bulletproof, and there's probably guards that drop from the ceiling to get you if you touch it. But it's super well lit, and then there are these little nooks in the wall, and one of them is this other Venus that's even older. It's the oldest Venus of Galgenberg. So it's the oldest sculptural representation of a woman, supposedly. But there's this writing from the curator about having these two Venuses that were both like discovered in proximity of each other, and thinking about I'm getting off track. As you do as a tourist, you have to take a picture to like prove you saw the thing, right? And so there was this moment, I'm standing in front of this, like it's 32,000 years old, this sculpture, and you get your iPhone out, and there's that moment of the cycle rate of the lights is out of phase with the frame rate of the camera, and so you get that scroll across the screen, which normally would be super irritating, but it was like, I think I just made art. So it's total like minimal gesture, but like that's what the whole piece there actually is, like that scroll across the surface, which is like this thing that we call them Venuses because that was like the first thought of what they, and then we don't actually know, and I really appreciate the way the museum presents them, which is we have no idea. We're pretty sure it's a figure of a woman, and that's about all we got. And they can date it, and they know the material, but like, what does it mean? Why did they make it? Who made it? Like, there's no way of ever knowing any of that stuff, right? And just the temporal idea of something that's 32,000 years old, and then like the layer of the screen was kind of like the meditation for me, like the impossibility. Like that scroll is highlighting the gap between me and that object, but also the impossibility of really accessing what that object is about, why it was made, etc. I'm gonna stop there. I feel like I'm ahead. If there's some questions, I would love to try and answer questions.
There's one more piece you didn't tell us about. Sorry.
Oh, it's hiding behind me. This is part of not quite a series of pieces. I'm always so jealous of painters, and I don't know if it's actually right or not, but my thinking is like, oh, a painter can just like go in the studio and they know what to work on, or so over the years I've sort of landed on like, well, here's an idea that can be iterative, like it could be another version of this, another version of this. So this goes back to like some pretty dumb stuff in a way, but like a kid and reading Indiana Jones books, and they were all the same plot, like the movies, is like this archaeological something or other that nobody could find, and then Indiana Jones is able to find it, but it's got magical powers, and if the Nazis steal it, they'll take over the world, and the Nazis get it, so he has to steal it back from the Nazis. So there was one of these novels that was about the Temple of Delphi in Greece, and the signature artifact of the story was the omphalos, or the navel stone, which I read the book and thought the whole, like, it's clearly made up. It's an Indiana Jones book, and then several years later realized that was a real thing, that was this carved stone at Delphi, and that it in part was connected to this myth of Zeus, who sent out 2 eagles or 2 ravens to circle the planet, and after they circled the Earth, they came back around where they met was the center of the Earth, and so they carved this marker, this navel stone, which is the belly button of the world. But after reading the book and then revisiting the idea, there were hundreds of them. That there wasn't just one navel stone, that it was like a marker of significance for various places around the Mediterranean and the classical world. And so it was this kind of like mind melt moment of like, I only have one belly button, the Earth should only have one belly button. But also the idea of it, so the original was this kind of like carved cone shape with net on it, and it is this kind of unity figure, is phallus and umbilical, sky and earth, etc. So mine is marble and feathers, playing off of those same ideas. But the notion that there is more than one center of the world has always struck me as actually like incredibly prescient and modern, which is to recognize that the only way you can experience the world is from your point of view, that you have to pivot on your axis. And so if we ask how many centers of the world there are, my first thought was 1, but the real answer is 5 billion and whatever number of people there are on the planet, right? Because it's the only way that the world makes sense or can be processed is from your center of rotation. That was longer than it needed to be, but that's that one.
Good question.
That's a good question. That's a tricky question too, because you're like, I like that one, but that needs a change on it. I think actually this is one that I was most excited to get together. It's a maquette for a bigger piece that may or may not eventually happen. So the 3D printed pieces are intended to be stone, and those are in process, but it's slow. But it was a moment to work with an image, work with that thought, but also kind of riff off of some Bernini Ecstasy of St. Teresa kind of business, which is, I don't know, sometimes when you're in the studio, you just want to like place somebody else's note, like try another riff for a minute, right? Besna.
So John, it's very nice to hear you speak about, or to see these words that I don't know of your word, just paintings, like called digital landscapes, and I really like that title. It's kind of like a medium for the word. And I wonder, because you talked about the bulbs, and I haven't seen the piece, but I will, and transporting something from one place to another, and as a form of connecting or keeping connection to, or translating, or I'm thinking about these processes of translation in my personal work, for example, and how I use those in order to distance myself from places, or see them in a different way, or understand them in a different way. So I wonder for these transitions, I really love that word there, or these kind of like cement blocks, like they could be, we could put them into a house or something.
Yeah.
And so I wonder, like as a construction element, and so I wonder, like, what does that translation process do to you in terms of, in the light of this, the time, the 2 years, or the hardship, or does it help you
That's a huge question. I don't know if I have a good answer for it. Still in it. When Brian was in the studio, we talked through a lot of that, and that making as a way of processing, probably for all of us. We were having an interesting conversation also the other day when we were installing with one of the artists in the, or actually no, it was yesterday at lunch, about when you have children, like when she was talking about when she became a mother, and all of a sudden she's like, I think my work's starting to be about motherhood, like that what you're living, it's for most of us unavoidable to separate that lived experience from what we're making, and vice versa. So on the one hand, there's that. In terms of, I don't know if I have an answer beyond that, other than,
Why does everything have to have an answer?
I'll take that too.
I feel like your work is very other dimensional. Because that's what I'm about, other dimensions, and, it has that feeling for me. Because that's what I'm about, so you read it, it's what you're about. But I like that, I keep waiting for this to lift up and go.
Yeah, Wes and I were saying it's like Sputnik. We're launching it. It's going in space at the end of this.
It's lights, though.
We have to roll it back to campus later. Heather?
I don't know if this will be your question, but I'll try.
Yeah.
So, in talking about how you're thinking in terms of emotion, it automatically makes me go to this idea of futurism and speed.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious how your choice of materials might possess speed in your perception, and how they either complement, contrast, and then ultimately the whole piece will have its own sense of speed. And if that also relates to your sense of time or different time periods.
Yeah. Whoa, that's cool.
Okay.
Yeah. What's your sense of speed in some of the, like I'm just going to type in a cheat code and have you help me get started, but.
Well, just the time and place of certain identifiable materials takes me too fast, but then sometimes the formal qualities will make me think of future.
Sure.
Like the scientific or sci-fi
Yeah.
idea of where we might be or where something might go. So it possesses like this simultaneous presence of past
Yeah, cool.
plays that actually I could like point to, I could go there. And then this other expansion of possibility, like a future existence. Or
Yeah.
something like that.
I'll take that answer. I don't know. I guess if I was going to try and respond to that, I would have to chew on it for a minute, because I feel like I would probably replace speed with a different word, maybe. This is an indirect way of answering it, but like the way you were talking about that piece reminded me of this. It's like a review of Star Wars at one point, but that there was a line in there where it said that part of why that movie was successful is that it managed to look really new and really familiar at the same time. And that feels like somehow that kind of relates to that idea of like, the recognizable thing or the thing of the past, and then this other thing that looks like maybe it's ahead of us or from a different timeline. I don't know if that makes any sense at all, but. Jared?
John, since I've heard you talk about your work at different moments in time, one thing that I've always really appreciated is this, like, Bernini, Roman mosaics, this Buddhist element to the flames. And so you're pulling from these different cultural moments, or you could think of them as art historical things, or, like it's just the history of humankind. with Star Wars, you know. Could, could you say a little bit more about, like, you know, you're pretty fluidly moving amongst all these things.
Mhm.
Talk a little bit about your interests, and is it reading that you've done, or how do you begin to pull these things together that they begin to
Yeah.
align and influence you?
That's a cool question. I like that one too. I would like rewind all the way to the beginning probably, which was somewhere early as an artist, or as a student even. There was a moment in like Sculpture 1 where there was that recognition of, oh wow, this can be anything. That it's not singular in its pursuit, that it's totally omnivorous, and so the research can change from like minute to minute, or even like, I don't know, quantum state within the minute, right? That it can be a video game and a Baroque sculpture, and that both of those lines of inquiry are valid. So for me, like my path into being an artist was kind of stumbling backwards into so interested in this, but I can't imagine doing just that for my whole life. And then so interested in that, but can't imagine doing just that for my whole life. And then this realization that art and sculpture in particular was this place where it got to be all of those, that you just get to change the hat moment to moment, and that it's all productive, and that everything is research. So then aside from that, I mean, I think that answer could apply for anybody in the room if you wanted it to, but from there then it's like your tastes and kind of like what are you interested in, and what questions are you interested in, and then what things make sense, not as answers to the question, but as ways of further exploring the question, maybe. That's a good question.
Again,
Brian?
picking up the glass, do you think that material can be a container for human resonance?
Resonance?
Resonance. Like the echo of human presence could be captured, not just signified or not just about memory, but that it would be contained in the material. Not unlike going to a historical site and feeling like the echo of presence from the past, even if you're there alone, or somewhat similar to how Dario Robledo uses a materialist to describe like the vinyl of a melted down Miles Davis record. Like, can material actually hold that, or is it not the vessel that can hold that much? I don't know. It's kind of a metaphysical.
Yeah, that's a good one. We're gonna need a podcast for that.
Serious.
That's the kind of question I like, because then we get to go back to like omnivorous mode, and I'm going to say yes and also no. Like there's one version of me is like, yeah, 100%, and then the other version of me is like, nothing lives in anything. That it's all like it's like what we perceive in a thing, right? So there is no essence, like we interpret the presence of essence. But I think yes. Like that's part of the attraction to the older, like a thing that has a patina or shows heavy human interaction, that it evinces a history and a place and a time, and yeah, it carries those connotations. Both. One more, if there is one more.
I'm trying to formulate my question, but so I feel like, is there something about like glitching that's of interest of you, of your work? Like, it's like, I see a lot of things like permanence, impermanence, the space between things, but like in translation. So, but then the translations are kind of like glitches, and I've been thinking a lot about like, I also think a lot about reality, you know, and I've heard you mention reality and your perception of reality a couple times, and one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is like simulation theory, and then I think about like the only moment that you really know that you're in is the current moment. So the like this futurist, like people calling this futuristic, but making digital drawings too is like sort of like feels futuristic compared to like hand drawing. But like I was just wondering, is there like, is it like glitches, or is there like, is like, you know, what? Because it's kind of like these benign moments that like it seems like a random thing inside the video game, the power lines that you're driving by. It's like the translation of the daffodils multiple times. I don't know what the question is, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm just like rambling.
No, I think that's a really good question, and that feels like one actually that goes like to the core of the practice from the past 2 decades, which is a lot of the mechanical pieces are rooted in, I don't usually use the word glitch because it feels more oriented towards the digital and versus these like analog machines, but the interest in the analog is exactly that slippage, the kind of like that it fails at a certain point, or it hiccups, or like as it wears it drifts. So the kind of happenstance of error when you set up a sequence with a kind of intention, but there's enough looseness in that sequence that unexpected things kind of come out of it. It's a kind of inverted approach that the organic emerges out of this like really regimented kind of mechanical system because there's just enough slippage in it. Does that make any sense? I think that applies mostly probably to like what you're seeing in the daffodils, maybe a little bit in the power poles, but I could spin it in other ways too. But I think I see vestiges of that in the preceding work. That's definitely in those works.